We looked in some cases for the most basic idea that leads so much of Russia policy astray. And one of the recurring ideas that we found was the notion that at some level deep down and fundamentally, Russia and the West must, after all, want to get along with each other and must have similar aims in how they can develop the relationship and work together in the world. That is a perfectly normal and natural approach for Western politicians and decision makers to have, because it's based on perfectly normal human instincts of optimism and of assuming that everybody actually wants the best. But it is completely inappropriate when it comes to dealing with Russia, simply because Russia's objectives, not only for its relationship with the West, but for its own place in the world, are in so many cases completely incompatible with what the West finds to be normal, natural, acceptable, moral, sometimes even legal. And we have to instead start from the founding point of the relationship that is actually based in reality rather than wishful thinking, namely that Russia does have strategic aims and geopolitical objectives which are fundamentally opposed to what the West can accept. We need to remember in all of this that the school in which Russia's view of the world has been trained is fundamentally different from that of the West. A different geography, a different history, a different mindset, a different way of organizing relationships, both between the state and people inside the country, and also the way international relations should be viewed. All of these provide a completely different framework from what the West takes for granted in terms of ordering international relations. The West's relationship with Russia would be on a much better footing if we abandoned the idea that fundamentally Russia must actually want to get along with the West, and that that's a driver for the relationship. If instead we start from the initial point that Russia's strategic aims and its geopolitical objectives are fundamentally incompatible with what the West finds acceptable or what the West thinks Russia should find desirable, that'll be a much more stable footing for building a relationship that has more of a basis in reality and far less in wishful thinking.
If you look at Russia itself and you leave aside the whole extraordinary apparatus of propaganda and disinformation, which goes well beyond anything we're prepared to contemplate and are willing to devote resources to, or even imagine, if you leave that aside and you talk to highly intelligent people in Russia, and very serious people, what's interesting about a lot of them is that they are at least as cynical about their own system, their own leaders, Putin and so on, as many of us are. Sometimes even more so. But they then turn around and say, but of course the United States is the same. And of course, the UK play into that. The societies in which we live in advanced democracies, they're what I call white lie societies. We all embroider and sanitize the truth. The problem with Russia is and it goes back a long way, it's a black lie society. You'll find people who are much more self-confident telling a bold-faced lie, even if they know it's a bold-faced lie, and even if they know you know. And the West doesn't understand that. And so when we hear the most outrageous Russian lies about things going on, including about our own behavior, supposedly, we naturally assume we're just hearing a white lie. But we have to accept the reality of it. And we don't want to. And I'm constantly saying to people, stop trying to persuade Putin that we're nice people. You know what? He will never believe you, and he really doesn't care. We live in a world where there are differences, and we have to accept it.
But I think we need to understand that in and of itself, a difficult relationship with Russia is not necessarily a tragedy. Because what Russia seeks to do in a revised European security order is, first of all, to give it special status, essentially allow Russia to veto security initiatives, security policies that it doesn't like. So first of all, further enlargement of NATO, for example. The second thing that Russia seeks to achieve is really Western acknowledgement that Russia has a sphere of influence around its borders, and that it can therefore dictate to countries like Ukraine in particular what Ukraine can and can't do in terms of its foreign policy, and also that Russia has the right to interfere in Ukraine's internal affairs. The third difference is a view within the Russian leadership that countries should be allowed to run their internal affairs, essentially as they see fit, largely free from external criticism. Now, on each of those counts, Western governments view the question of sovereignty very differently. When it comes to European security, Western governments do not believe that certain countries should have special rights over and above the rights of other countries. Sovereignty, as understood in most Western countries, involves an important normative dimension, focusing on issues like human rights, fundamental freedoms, democracy. A good relationship with a country like Russia is ultimately a means to an end. It's there to enable us, where possible, to defend and promote our interests. But if you don't have a good relationship with a country like Russia, in and of itself, I don't think that that's a tragedy. The aim really should be to ensure that those differences and those disagreements are managed effectively so that they don't get out of control, they don't lead to more serious forms of confrontation.